Did you hear that?
All right, I'm starting now. All right, everybody, welcome to Unit 2. So we're looking at the different economic indicators here, unemployment, the consumer price index, GDP, things like that. So to start out with some of the basic terminology, economists measure the health of the economy by looking at key economic indicators like GDP, the unemployment rate would be the second big one, and the consumer price index is how we measure inflation. The circular flow model, which again is that kind of big circular diagram that we're looking at the flow of goods and services for money. We're looking at how households, businesses, and the government all interact with each other in those two different markets, the factor market and the product market, and how money kind of flows throughout them. The big one we're going to look at is GDP. It's the value of all final goods and services produced in a country within 1 year specifically. So we're looking at the GDP for 2025 or 2024. We're looking at one specific year. There are three types of unemployment. We're looking at frictional, structural, and cyclical. Frictional unemployment being voluntary unemployment, if I quit my job to try to find something else. Structural unemployment is when people's skills don't fit into the structure of the economy anymore. If we're looking at Uber drivers or taxi drivers, if they all get replaced by self-driving cars, that would be structural unemployment. And cyclical unemployment follows the business cycle. So if we fall into a recession or depression, that's where we'd see the cyclical unemployment. The economy is at full employment when there's no cyclical unemployment. So again, if our economy is doing well, we're still going to have some unemployment. We'll still have frictional and structural unemployment. But full employment is when there's no cyclical unemployment, when there's no one unemployed because of a poor economy. And the final part, real GDP, is when we adjust GDP for inflation. So you might see nominal GDP and you might see real GDP. Nominal GDP on paper is what we produced in our country in a given year. Real GDP is once we've adjusted that for inflation. So our expenditure approach to GDP, we're looking at the different types of spending and the income approach. You know, any dollar that's spent is also made by somebody else. So with the expenditure approach, we're adding up the consumer spending, which is the everyday things that we would purchase, the government spending, you know, on the military, or schools, or healthcare, business investments, which again would be like buying new machinery, new technology, hiring more workers. That would all be a business investment. And then we've got net exports, or XN. Exports minus imports. Exports we make money off of, imports we're losing money off of. Exports minus imports would be our net exports. The income approach, we're adding up all the income made in our country. So kind of break these down into this. Wages would be the money made by labor or individuals. Interest would be made from capital goods. So if I am renting out a forklift, you know, that would be interest that I'd be making off of that. Rent would be money made off of land resources, and profit would be made by entrepreneurs. So it kind of goes back to those factors of production. So the expenditure approach, if I spend $10,000 building a shed in my backyard, that'd be the expenditure approach. That $10,000 is also wages for somebody else. So it'll always equal up to each other. The value added approach is adding up the intermediary or intermediate goods in a process. So if I am looking at including a loaf of bread in GDP, the store selling the loaf of bread would be the expenditure approach. The money that I give the store would be the income approach. The value added approach would say, okay, the farmer growing the wheat, you know, added in 50 cents worth of value to that bread. The shipping company that took it to the bakery added in $1 worth of value to the bread. And then the baker themselves and their services added on another $1. If that loaf of bread is sold for $2, all three of these should add up to each other. We usually use this expenditure approach because it's easier to calculate, but the others will add up to the same thing as well. All right, if we're looking at the circular flow model, businesses sell goods and services to households in the product market. So we buy finished products in the product market. If you go to Walmart to buy your groceries, you're buying it in the product market. And in return, you're giving them your money. So we go to a clothing store and buy their products, and we give them money in return, product market. The other market would be the resource market or the factor market, where us as households are selling our resources to businesses or firms. Right now, as I make this video, I'm in the factor market. I'm in the resource market. I'm providing my labor in return for wages. If you go to work at Grandy's after this, you'd be in the resource market. You're providing your labor to this business. Public goods and services are provided by the government and are funded through taxpayer dollars, right? Any school or park or military, right, all collected through taxes by the government. We redistribute that money out through these other programs. So if we're looking at each of the following, these different types of spending, consumer spending, let's say, would be like a cheeseburger, right? You're buying it, it's for you, you're meant to consume it immediately. Investment spending, again, isn't stocks and bonds. It would be, a restaurant buying a new oven, right? They're buying something that they think is going to make them more efficient or make them more productive or profitable in the future. Government spending could be a school or a road or a hospital. And the net exports, we export from Georgia, let's say peaches, and we import, let's say TVs, right? Now generally we import way more than we export, and so that would create negative net exports. We lose money each year on trade, but that's a different lesson down the road. Now, if we're looking at GDP and what we include and what we don't include, so as far as things that we don't include financial transactions, so stocks and bonds. We're not actually, GDP measures what we're producing. Whenever you buy stocks, you're not actually producing anything. So we don't include, financial transactions like money into stocks or bonds or a savings account. We don't include black market transactions, things that can't be counted, right? If you're looking at the buying and selling of drugs, not included in GDP because there's not a way to calculate it. And then the final one would be what we call non-market transactions. These are things that have value, but they're not really in any kind of market. If I stayed at home to raise my kids for the next year, that has value, right? I would save money on daycare for both of them, but it's not going to be included in GDP anywhere. I wouldn't be included in the labor market anymore. If I go and mow my grass outside, that has value. I could pay somebody money to do that, but doing it myself wouldn't be included in GDP. It's not a transaction that's happening. All right, the next one's asking some true and false statements, so let's take a look through these. Services are not counted in the calculation of GDP because nothing new is produced. Services are how we produce these goods. So that would be false, right? Me as a teacher, I'm providing a service, but I'm part of GDP. I'm part of government spending. Intermediate goods are used in the production process to produce final goods. That's true. When we're looking at this expenditure approach, if we're looking at a pair of shoes, that's the final good. If we're looking at the rubber or the cloth that goes into the shoes, that's the intermediate goods. Those intermediate goods make up the final goods, and we don't count them because then we'd be counting everything twice. If we counted the value of the cloth and the leather and the rubber, and then counted the value of the shoes, we would pretty much be counting everything twice. A new paint job on a used car is not counted in GDP. False, right? That's a service that we're providing. The value of the used car wouldn't be added, but the value of the paint job would be added onto GDP. Investment spending is spending on financial assets like stocks and bonds. False, right? That if we're looking at it from an economics viewpoint, investment spending is anything purchasing by a business that's going to make them more productive or efficient. Subsidies to businesses are examples of a transfer payment. That's another thing that we don't include in GDP, right? That money is taken out of our taxes and then distributed out to, let's say, the elderly for Social Security. Nothing's actually being produced there, so we wouldn't be including that as part of GDP. Subsidies are the same thing. The government collects taxpayer dollars. They give it out to businesses to make it cheaper to produce. They give it out to college students to make it cheaper to go to college. So this is true, but it's not something we include in GDP. Which takes us to the next one. Transfer payments are not counted in the calculation of GDP. True, nothing's actually getting produced there. So me getting the Hope Scholarship to go to college, not included in GDP. But the government giving me money to teach you all is included in GDP, because me providing this education as a service, it's included in GDP. The equation for net exports is imports minus exports. False. It's the other way around. So exports minus imports. Exports are the money that we make. Imports are the money that we lose. Let me pause it real quick and I'll be right back with you guys. Oh, you got it? Thank you. New housing construction is considered investment in counting GDP. Good. That is true. This is a little funky one because we're purchasing the house to live in. It seems like it would be a consumer good. It is actually considered a business investment because we could then sell it on or we could rent it out. So oddly enough, producing a new house is considered an investment. Canada's GDP includes goods produced in other countries by Canadian companies. False. We're looking at all the goods produced within a country in a given year. So right now it's kind of weird. BMW and Mitsubishi are German and Korean automakers. They've got plants around Statesboro. When they produce cars, that is included in our GDP. But when Ford and Chevy produce a car in Mexico, that's not included in our GDP. So it doesn't matter who owns the company, it just matters where that good's produced. Inventories, goods that have been produced by a business that have not yet been sold, are counted in GDP as investment. This is another kind of weird, funky one. It is true because the idea is that they're going to sell it at some point. So it's an investment. They built all of these things now with the anticipation that it's going to be sold later. It's no different than with the housing construction, that sometimes houses are built before they have a buyer. So we're building them thinking, all right, it's going to be more beneficial for us in the future when we sell them. All right, let's look at unemployment. For each example, identify if the person faces frictional, structural, or cyclical unemployment, or if they're not counted in the labor force. All right, so Avery loses her job because of a recession and decides to stop looking for work. If she's stopped looking for work, she's not counted in the labor force, right? The labor force is just people that are employed and people that are unemployed. She's not considered unemployed because she stopped looking for work. Lindsay quits her part-time job at a restaurant to search for a full-time job. Yes, she also doesn't have a job, but she is looking for a full-time job. So if she chose to quit, the key word there being quit, right, that would be our frictional unemployment or voluntary unemployment. Dave lost his job at a toy factory due to a national slowdown in production. If we're looking at an economic slowdown or a recession, that would be our cyclical unemployment, right, when people lose their jobs in a downturn in the business cycle. If there's not a demand for the good, that's where we see cyclical unemployment, generally. After graduating from college, James lacks the skills to fill any available jobs. So if his skills aren't needed in the workforce, that's structural unemployment. I had a friend who graduated college with a philosophy degree. He had a lot of trouble finding a job that related to that. He was structurally unemployed. And then Daniel retires from being a lawyer and volunteers at a local museum full-time. This one's also kind of funky. Volunteers aren't considered part of the workforce. Even though they provide something valuable, they're not counted. Even though he's full-time, if he's not getting paid for it, it's not considered employed. But he's also not unemployed because he's not looking for work. Now, as far as calculating unemployment goes, it's just a little bit of math here just to kind of make sure we're on the right track. One second. The number of workers in the labor force to start out with. We're looking at everybody that's employed and everybody that's unemployed. We've got 720 people that are employed, full-time and part-time. And we've got 80 people that are unemployed. Add those up together, that's 800 people in the labor force. Everybody that's employed and unemployed. The labor force participation rate is looking at the labor force over the population times 100. So the labor force is the 800 people that we mentioned earlier. Population, 1,600. And so the labor force participation rate would be 50%. What is the equation for calculating the unemployment rate? Here we're looking at the number of unemployed over that labor force times 100. So we said our labor force was 800 people. Everybody that's employed and unemployed, that's 800 people. All right, and the number of unemployed that we have are 80. 80 over 100 is 0.1 times 100. Our unemployment rate here would be 10%. Now this one's kind of tricky. Assuming that 50 of the 80 people of the unemployed workers also become discouraged workers, calculate the new unemployment rate. So that changes things. If those people become discouraged workers, they're no longer in the labor force. So if it goes from 80 down to 30, because we're losing 50 of those workers, so 80 down to 30. All right, things change a little bit. First off, our labor force is now going to be 750. We've got 720 people that are employed, 30 people that are unemployed. So that would be 750. All right, the number of unemployed that we have are 30. 30 over 750 comes out to, I think, 4%. Y'all might want to double check me on the math on that, but that would be our new unemployment rate. Why are discouraged workers not included in the unemployment rate? It's because they're not unemployed. They're not looking for a job. So if I lose my job teaching and I decide that I'm just not going to, I'm going to, be a stay-at-home dad, or I'm not going to look for another job, I'm not considered unemployed. I'm not eligible for unemployment benefits. I'm not eligible for any kind of programs like that. I would be out of the labor force then. So this is kind of how they like to ask these questions on the AP test. Assuming the economy saw an increase in discouraged workers, does the unemployment rate overstate or understate the actual level of joblessness in the economy? So what we see here, that unemployment rate actually went down. Those discouraged workers, those 50 people that left the labor force, that lowered down the unemployment rate to 4%. So it understates the actual level of joblessness, because we're not looking at the people that don't have jobs. We're just looking at the people that don't have jobs that want them. So if workers become discouraged, that unemployment rate, and leave the labor force, that unemployment rate actually goes down because those people are no longer in the labor force. What happens to the unemployment rate when full-time workers involuntarily become part-time workers? So if let's say they told me I'm not fired, but I lose my job and I become I work half days, nothing would happen to the unemployment rate. I'm still employed. Even if I'm a part-time worker, I'm employed still. So nothing would happen to the unemployment rate there. The natural rate of unemployment is looking at the amount of unemployment that's normal for a society. So the natural rate of unemployment is just the frictional and the structural unemployment. That no matter how well our economy is doing, we're always going to have people that are looking for better jobs. Let's say that 2% of our workforce is frictionally unemployed. They're just looking for better jobs. In structural unemployment, as our economy advances, old skills are no longer needed anymore. So if we're looking at the Uber driver or the taxi driver that loses their job, they would be structurally unemployed. And again, that's a normal part of our economy because it means that we're growing. We don't need old ways of doing things. So let's say that 3% of the population or the labor force is structurally unemployed. That natural rate of unemployment then would be 5%. So natural unemployment means that we don't have any cyclical unemployment. And that kind of takes us to 28. Full employment doesn't mean that there's no unemployment. There's always going to be some unemployment. It just means no cyclical unemployment. Sorry, sloppy handwriting. So this would be our full employment here. If we have 2% frictional unemployment, 3% structural unemployment, this would be our full employment. That doesn't mean that nobody that wants work can't find it. It just means that it's not for economic reasons. It's not because we're in a recession or depression or anything like that. All right, we'll take a quick pause and take a look at the second half of this unit.